What if I told you a family of four vanished without a trace during their dream vacation in Napa Valley, and the only clue to their fate was discovered 4 years later by a truffle hunter's pig digging in the wrong place at the wrong time? This is the story that made me question everything I thought I knew about missing persons cases. The Lewis family disappeared in 1989, but what emerged from the California soil in 1993 wasn't just evidence, it was a nightmare that no one saw coming. If you're ready to dive into one of the most disturbing, unsolved mysteries I've ever investigated, hit that subscribe button and let's uncover the truth together. I've been investigating cold cases for over 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Missing persons, unexplained disappearances, families that vanished into thin air. But the Lewis family case haunts me in ways I never expected. It started as a simple vacation gone wrong and evolved into something far more sinister. Something that makes you question whether some mysteries are meant to stay buried. The Lewis family seemed like the perfect American dream. Richard Lewis, 42, was a successful architect from San Francisco. His wife Margaret, 38, taught elementary school and had that infectious laugh that made everyone feel welcome. Their two children, Emily, 14, and David, 10, were bright kids with their whole lives ahead of them. They were the kind of family you'd see in vacation brochures, smiling, happy, living their best life. In July 1989, Richard had surprised his family with a 2-week vacation to Napa Valley. He'd rented a secluded cabin on the outskirts of St. Helena, surrounded by rolling vineyards and towering oak trees. The property was called Whispering Pines, and it sat at the end of a winding dirt road, miles from the nearest neighbor. Richard told his colleagues it was the perfect place to disconnect from the world and reconnect with his family. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and large windows that looked out over the valley. Margaret had called her sister on July 15th, describing the breathtaking sunsets and how the kids were loving the freedom to explore. Emily was reading by the fireplace every evening, and David was collecting rocks and leaves, building elaborate fairy houses around the property. It was, Margaret said, the perfect family vacation. That phone call on July 15th was the last anyone ever heard from the Lewis family. When they failed to check out of the cabin on July 22nd, the property manager, Tom Brennan, drove up to investigate. What he found defied explanation. The cabin was pristine, as if the family had simply evaporated mid-vacation. Their luggage was neatly packed, beds were made, and there was no sign of struggle or disturbance. But there were details that made no sense. The car was parked in the driveway, keys on the kitchen counter. All their personal belongings were still there, wallets, identification, even Margaret's purse with over $300 cash inside. The refrigerator was full of food, some of it beginning to spoil. David's rock collection sat carefully arranged on the coffee table, and Emily's book lay open on the couch, a bookmark placed exactly halfway through. The local sheriff's department treated it as a missing persons case, but from the beginning, nothing added up. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of violence, and no indication that the family had planned to leave. Search teams combed the surrounding wilderness for weeks, using dogs, helicopters, and thermal imaging equipment. They found nothing, not a single trace of the Lewis family. The investigation revealed even more puzzling details. The night before they disappeared, Richard had made dinner reservations at a nearby restaurant for July 16th. Margaret had scheduled a wine tour for July 18th. Emily had checked out 3 books from the local library, due back on July 20th. These weren't the actions of people planning to disappear. These were the actions of a family enjoying their vacation and making plans for the days ahead. Theories emerged almost immediately. Some believed the family had staged their own disappearance, perhaps to escape financial troubles or legal issues. But Richard's architectural firm was thriving, and there were no debts or legal problems. Others suggested they had encountered foul play, perhaps stumbling upon illegal activities in the remote vineyard area. The late 1980s saw occasional drug trafficking through rural California, but there was no evidence to support this theory. The more investigators dug, the more mysterious it became. The cabin's guestbook showed that the Lewis family had been the only occupants for the previous 2 weeks. The nearest neighbors were over a mile away and had seen nothing unusual. Store receipts showed that Margaret had purchased groceries on July 14th, including fresh produce and milk, not the actions of someone planning to disappear the next day. As weeks turned to months, the case grew cold. The FBI was consulted, but without evidence of kidnapping or interstate crime, their involvement was limited. The media attention faded, and the Lewis family joined the growing list of unexplained disappearances. Richard's architectural firm hired a private investigator, and Margaret's school held fundraisers for search efforts, but leads dried up. The cabin at Whispering Pines sat empty, avoided by tourists and locals alike. By 1993, the Lewis family had become a local legend. People in Napa Valley whispered about the family that vanished into thin air, and the cabin where they'd stayed became known as cursed. Property values in the area dropped, and the owners struggled to find renters. The case file gathered dust on sheriff's department shelves, and the family's relatives had reluctantly begun to accept that they might never know what happened to Richard, Margaret, Emily, and David. But then came March 15th, 1993. Jean-Paul Dubois, a French immigrant who had started a small truffle hunting business in Napa Valley, was working his property about 2 miles from the Whispering Pines cabin. His prized pig, Brigitte, was having an exceptional day, locating several valuable truffles in the oak grove that bordered his land. But around 3 p.m., Brigitte began behaving strangely. The pig started digging frantically near the base of a large oak tree, ignoring Jean-Paul's commands to move on. This wasn't typical truffle hunting behavior. Brigitte was disciplined and focused, but she kept digging, snorting and squealing with an intensity that made Jean-Paul uneasy. He tried to pull her away, but she was determined. Something was buried beneath that tree, and it wasn't truffles. Jean-Paul finally decided to investigate. He grabbed a shovel from his truck and began digging where Brigitte had been focused. About 3 feet down, his shovel struck something hard, not a rock or root, but something metallic. He carefully excavated around it, revealing what appeared to be a small metal box, tarnished and partially corroded from years in the soil. Inside the box, wrapped in plastic, were items that made Jean-Paul's blood run cold. A child's bracelet with the name Emily engraved on it, a man's watch with an inscription, "To Richard all my love, Margaret, Christmas 1987. A small notebook with pages of what looked like desperate handwriting. And most disturbing of all, a Polaroid photograph of 4 people bound and gagged, their eyes wide with terror. Jean-Paul immediately called the sheriff's department. Within hours, the quiet oak grove was crawling with investigators, forensic specialists, and crime scene technicians. The box was carefully processed, and its contents sent to the FBI lab in Quantico. The photograph was confirmed to show the Lewis family, but the location was impossible to determine. The lighting suggested an indoor setting, but the background revealed nothing identifiable. The notebook contained the most chilling evidence. Written in Margaret's handwriting, the pages documented their final hours. The entries were fragmented, written in fear and haste, but they painted a terrifying picture. The family had been taken from the cabin on the night of July 15th by someone they initially trusted, someone who had convinced them to leave willingly, only to imprison them somewhere nearby. Margaret's final entry was dated July 18th, 3 days after they disappeared. It read, "Emily is sick. David won't stop crying. Richard says we need to be strong, but I can see the fear in his eyes. He comes every day with food and water, but something has changed. He looks at us differently now. I'm hiding this notebook in my sleeve. If something happens to us, I pray someone finds it. Tell our families we love them. Tell them we fought." The The discovery of the box raised more questions than it answered. How had it ended up buried 2 miles from the cabin? Who had put it there and why? The forensic analysis revealed that the box had been in the ground for approximately 4 years, consistent with the family's disappearance. But there were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, and no clues about who might have buried it. The investigation was reopened with renewed intensity. The area around the oak tree was excavated extensively, but no human remains were found. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the surrounding area, but they found nothing. The box seemed to be the only evidence of the family's fate, and it raised the horrifying possibility that they had been held captive for several days before something terrible happened to them. What disturbed investigators most was the calculated nature of the crime. Whoever had taken the Lewis family had been organized and methodical. They had removed the family from the cabin without leaving a trace, held them captive for days, and then somehow disposed of 4 bodies so thoroughly that no trace remained. The buried box felt like a deliberate taunt, a message left for someone to find years later. The discovery of the metal box changed everything about the Lewis family investigation, but not in the way anyone expected. Within weeks of the find, Detective Maria Santos was assigned as the lead investigator, and she approached the case with fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques. Santos had built her reputation on solving cold cases that others had given up on, and she was determined to find answers that had eluded investigators for 4 years. Santos began by re-examining every piece of evidence from the original investigation. She interviewed Tom Brennan, the property manager, multiple times, pressing him for details he might have forgotten. She discovered that Brennan had failed to mention several key facts during the initial investigation. The cabin's previous renters had reported strange noises at night, footsteps on the roof, tapping on windows, and what sounded like voices coming from the walls. 3 different families had cut their stays short, complaining of an unsettling atmosphere. More disturbing was Brennan's revelation that the Whispering Pines property had a history of unexplained incidents. In 1985, an elderly couple had reported seeing lights in the forest at night, moving in patterns that didn't match any known wildlife or human activity. In 1987, a family with young children had called the sheriff's department, claiming someone had been watching their cabin from the tree line. When deputies investigated, they found footprints leading to an old mine shaft that had been sealed decades earlier. Santos decided to explore the mine shaft theory. Historical records showed that the area had been extensively mined for mercury in the early 1900s, leaving behind a network of tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the hillsides. Many of these mines had been improperly sealed, creating hidden spaces that could easily conceal criminal activity. The sealed mine shaft near the cabin had been closed in 1962, but Santos discovered that the concrete barrier had been recently disturbed. Working with a specialized cave rescue team, Santos explored the mine shaft in late 1993. What they found, 20 feet below ground, was a makeshift prison that had been carefully constructed and recently abandoned. The underground chamber had been equipped with basic amenities: a chemical toilet, sleeping bags, and a small camping stove. But the most chilling discovery was the evidence of long-term captivity. Chains bolted to the rock walls, scratch marks on the stone where someone had desperately clawed at their restraints, and children's drawings carved into the walls with a sharp object. The forensic analysis of the underground chamber revealed traces of the Lewis family's DNA. Hair samples matched Margaret and Emily, while fabric fibers matched clothing they had been wearing when they disappeared. But more disturbing was the evidence that they hadn't been alone down there. DNA from at least 2 other individuals was found, suggesting that the Lewis family had been held captive alongside other victims. Santos expanded her investigation to include missing persons cases throughout Northern California. What she discovered was a pattern of disappearances that stretched back nearly a decade. Families and individuals had been vanishing from remote vacation rentals, camping sites, and isolated properties throughout the wine country. Most cases had been investigated separately, with no one connecting the dots until Santos began mapping the disappearances. The pattern was chilling in its precision. Every 6 to 8 months, someone would disappear from a remote location in Napa, Sonoma, or Mendocino counties. The victims were always tourists or vacationers, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. The locations were always isolated, accessible by single roads that could be easily monitored. And in every case, the disappearances occurred during new moon phases, when the nights were darkest. Santos's investigation revealed that someone had been systematically targeting visitors to the area for nearly 10 years. The underground chamber was just one of several locations where victims had been held. Ground-penetrating radar surveys identified at least 3 other sealed mine shafts in the area, all showing signs of recent disturbance. The scope of the operation was staggering. Someone had been running a sophisticated kidnapping and imprisonment operation right under the noses of law enforcement. The breakthrough came when Santos discovered that all the affected properties had been managed by the same company, Vintage Properties, a small firm that specialized in vacation rentals in wine country. The company had been in business since 1982, and its owner, Harold Vance, had access to every property, knew the schedules of every guest, and could easily monitor who was staying where and when. Vance was a 58-year-old loner who lived in a converted barn on the outskirts of Calistoga. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and seemed to be a respected member of the community. But Santos's investigation revealed a different picture. Vance had purchased the property management company in 1982, immediately after being discharged from the military following a psychiatric evaluation. His military records, which took months to obtain, showed a history of increasingly erratic behavior and a fascination with controlling and confining people. When Santos obtained a search warrant for Vance's property in February 1994, she expected to find evidence of his crimes. What she found was far worse than anyone had imagined. Vance's barn contained detailed files on dozens of families who had stayed at properties he managed. The files included photographs taken without the family's knowledge, detailed notes about their daily routines, and disturbing psychological profiles that read like a predator's hunting guide. But Vance himself was nowhere to be found. Neighbors reported that he had left suddenly in January 1994, just days after news of the Lewis family discovery had been prominently featured in local newspapers. His truck was found abandoned at San Francisco International Airport, and security footage showed him boarding a flight to Mexico City. By the time authorities in Mexico were notified, Harold Vance had vanished into the sprawling underground networks of a foreign country. The investigation of Vance's property revealed the full scope of his operation. Hidden beneath the barn was another underground chamber, this one much larger and more sophisticated than the mine shaft. The chamber contained evidence of at least 12 different victims, including personal items that matched missing persons reports dating back to 1983. Among the items were Emily Lewis's diary, which contained entries describing the horror of their captivity, and David Lewis's toy dinosaur, which his parents had given him for his 10th birthday. Emily's diary entries were the most difficult evidence to process. Written in the trembling handwriting of a terrified 14-year-old, they described weeks of captivity in the underground chamber. The family had been taken from their cabin by Vance, who had convinced them that there was a gas leak and they needed to evacuate immediately. Once they were away from the cabin, he had drugged them and transported them to the mine shaft. The diary revealed that the Lewis family had been held captive for over 3 weeks, not the 3 days indicated by Margaret's notebook. Emily wrote about other prisoners who had been in the chamber when they arrived, an elderly couple from Oregon and a young man from San Francisco. She described how Vance would visit them daily, bringing food and water, but also conducting bizarre psychological experiments that seemed designed to break their will to resist. The final entries in Emily's diary were almost unreadable, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as her condition deteriorated. She described how the other prisoners had been taken away one by one, never to return. She wrote about her father's desperate attempts to escape and how Vance had punished the family by reducing their food and water. The last entry, dated August 12, 1989, simply read, "I don't think we're going to make it home. I want Mom and Dad to know that I love them. I want David to know that I tried to protect him. If someone finds this, please tell our family that we were brave." The discovery of Emily's diary and the evidence in Vance's underground chamber provided closure of a sort, but it also opened new wounds. The Lewis family's fate was no longer a mystery. They had been victims of a methodical predator who had evaded justice by fleeing the country. But their bodies were never found, and Harold Vance remained at large, possibly continuing his crimes in Mexico or elsewhere. Santos continued investigating the case for several more years, following leads that took her as far as Central America. She discovered that Vance had been spotted in various locations throughout Mexico and Guatemala, always moving, always one step ahead of authorities. There were reports of similar disappearances in remote tourist areas, suggesting that he had simply relocated his operation to a new hunting ground. The case remains officially open today, more than 30 years after the Lewis family disappeared. Harold Vance would be in his 80s now, but there's no evidence that he ever stopped his predatory activities. The underground chambers in Napa Valley were sealed permanently, and the properties where families had disappeared were sold to new owners who were unaware of their dark history. Detective Santos retired in 2003, but she never stopped thinking about the Lewis family case. She established a foundation that provides support to families of missing persons, and she continues to receive tips and leads about Harold Vance's whereabouts. She believes that Vance is still alive, still hunting, and still evading justice somewhere in the world. The metal box that Jean-Paul Dubois' pig had unearthed was eventually determined to be a deliberate message from Harold Vance. Forensic analysis revealed that it had been buried shortly after the Lewis family's disappearance, positioned carefully where it would eventually be found. The box contained evidence that Vance wanted discovered, not to help the victims, but to showcase his work and taunt law enforcement. The Lewis family's story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide in the most unexpected places. Harold Vance had operated his kidnapping and murder operation for over a decade, targeting innocent families who were simply trying to enjoy their vacations. He had turned the beautiful wine country of Northern California into his personal hunting ground, and he had done so with meticulous planning and cold-blooded efficiency. Today, the locations where the Lewis family and other victims were held captive are marked only by concrete barriers and no trespassing signs. The wine country has moved on, the tourism industry has recovered, and new families continue to visit the area for relaxing vacations. But those who know the truth about Harold Vance and his victims can never look at the rolling hills and peaceful vineyards the same way again. The case remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in California history, not because we don't know what happened, but because justice was never served. Harold Vance escaped accountability for his crimes, and the families of his victims are left with the knowledge that their loved ones suffered terribly in their final days. The Lewis family's fate is known, but their killer remains free, somewhere in the world, possibly still hunting new victims. In 2001, 7 years after Vance's disappearance, I received a call that made my blood run cold. A detective in Guatemala City had discovered what appeared to be another underground chamber, this one beneath an abandoned coffee plantation outside the city. The chamber contained personal items from several American and European tourists who had disappeared in the region over the previous 5 years. Among the items was a California driver's license belonging to Harold Vance, but the photograph had been carefully removed. The Guatemalan authorities had been investigating a series of missing persons cases that bore striking similarities to the Napa Valley disappearances. Foreign tourists would rent isolated properties for vacation, only to vanish without a trace. Their rental cars would be found abandoned, their belongings left behind, and no witnesses could recall seeing them leave. The pattern was identical to Vance's California operation, suggesting he had simply relocated his hunting ground to a new country with less sophisticated law enforcement. I traveled to Guatemala City in 2002 to assist with the investigation. The underground chamber was remarkably similar to the ones found in Napa Valley, carefully constructed, equipped with basic amenities, and designed for long-term captivity. But this chamber was larger, more sophisticated, and showed evidence of housing up to a dozen people simultaneously. The scope of the operation suggested that Vance had not only continued his crimes, but had expanded them significantly. The local investigators shared their files with me, revealing a disturbing escalation in Vance's methods. While his California victims had been held for weeks or months, the evidence in Guatemala suggested he was keeping people captive for much longer periods. Personal items found in the chamber dated back nearly 3 years, indicating that some victims had been held for extended periods before being killed. The psychological torture had also intensified, with evidence of systematic attempts to break his victims' sanity through isolation, starvation, and psychological manipulation. Among the evidence recovered from the Guatemalan chamber was a detailed journal written by Vance himself. The journal, written in a mixture of English and broken Spanish, provided a chilling glimpse into the mind of a methodical predator. Vance documented his hunting techniques, his methods for selecting victims, and his psychological experiments on captives. He wrote about his victims with clinical detachment, referring to them as subjects, and describing their suffering as valuable research data. The journal revealed that Vance had been refining his techniques since his military discharge in 1982. He had spent years studying psychology, criminology, and law enforcement procedures, learning how to avoid detection and minimize evidence. His move to Guatemala wasn't random. He had carefully researched the country's law enforcement capabilities and had identified areas where he could operate with minimal risk of discovery. More disturbing was Vance's documentation of his long-term goals. He wasn't simply a serial killer driven by impulse. He was conducting systematic research into human behavior under extreme stress. His journals described elaborate experiments designed to test the psychological breaking points of different personality types. He had categorized his victims by age, gender, and psychological profile, documenting their responses to various forms of captivity and torture. The Guatemalan investigation also revealed that Vance had been selling some of his victims into human trafficking networks. Several of the missing tourists had been young women traveling alone, and evidence suggested they had been transported to other parts of Central America rather than killed. This added another horrifying dimension to Vance's crimes. He wasn't just a killer, but a trafficker who was profiting from human misery on an international scale. By 2003, the trail had gone cold again. The Guatemalan authorities raided the coffee plantation where the chamber had been discovered, but Vance had vanished months earlier. Local reports suggested he had fled to Mexico or possibly Costa Rica, but concrete evidence was scarce. The international investigation was hampered by jurisdictional issues, language barriers, and the limited resources of Central American law enforcement agencies. I returned to California frustrated and haunted by what I had discovered. The case had evolved from a family tragedy into something much larger and more sinister. Vance wasn't just responsible for the Lewis family's death. He was likely responsible for dozens of disappearances across multiple countries. His operation had grown from a local predator targeting wine country tourists to an international trafficking network that spanned continents. The families of Vance's victims struggled to cope with the knowledge that their loved one's killer remained free. Richard Lewis's brother, Michael, established a foundation dedicated to tracking international predators and supporting families of missing persons. The foundation worked with law enforcement agencies across the Americas, sharing information and resources to help solve similar cases. In 2008, there was another potential sighting. A retired FBI agent vacationing in Costa Rica reported seeing a man who matched Vance's description working at a small hotel in a remote mountain village. The man was older, grayer, but had the same cold eyes and methodical manner that witnesses had described. By the time local authorities investigated, the man had disappeared, leaving behind only a false name and a partially burned passport. The most recent development came in 2019, when advances in DNA technology allowed for new analysis of evidence from the original crime scenes. The enhanced DNA profiles revealed that Vance had an accomplice, someone who had been present at multiple crime scenes but whose identity remained unknown. This revelation suggested that Vance's operation had been even more sophisticated than previously believed, involving a network of collaborators who helped him identify, capture, and dispose of victims. The accomplice's DNA was run through international databases, but no matches were found. This person had never been arrested, never been in the military, and never been fingerprinted for any legal reason. They were a ghost, someone who had managed to participate in multiple murders while remaining completely invisible to law enforcement. The discovery raised disturbing questions about how many other people might have been involved in Vance's crimes. Today, 34 years after the Lewis family disappeared, Harold Vance would be 82 years old. Most investigators believe he's still alive, possibly still operating somewhere in Latin America, where law enforcement resources are limited and corruption is common. The FBI maintains an active file on the case, and Vance remains on their most wanted list, but the chances of apprehending him diminish with each passing year. The impact of Vance's crimes extends far beyond his immediate victims. The tourism industry in Napa Valley was permanently changed by the revelations about his operation. Vacation rental companies now conduct extensive background checks on their managers, and many properties have installed security systems and regular check-in procedures. The wine country that once marketed itself as a peaceful escape from urban life had to confront the reality that predators could operate undetected for years. The Lewis family's story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolated vacation rentals and the importance of maintaining contact with family and friends while traveling. But it's also a reminder that evil can hide behind the most mundane facades. Harold Vance was a respected property manager, a veteran, and a seemingly normal member of his community. His crimes were hidden not by elaborate deception, but by simple ordinariness. In 2021, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when many people were reassessing their lives and cleaning out old belongings, something extraordinary happened. Margaret Lewis's sister, Patricia, was going through boxes of family memorabilia when she discovered a letter that had been mailed to Margaret just days before the family's disappearance. The letter had been delivered to Patricia's address by mistake and had somehow gotten mixed in with her own correspondence, forgotten for over 30 years. The letter was from a woman named Sarah Chen, who had stayed at the Whispering Pines cabin 6 months before the Lewis family. Sarah had written to warn Margaret about strange experiences during her stay, feeling watched, hearing footsteps around the cabin at night, and discovering that someone had been inside their cabin while they were away during the day. Most disturbing was Sarah's claim that she had seen the property manager, Harold Vance, using a key to enter their cabin multiple times when he thought they were gone. Patricia immediately contacted the FBI, who verified the letter's authenticity and traced Sarah Chen to Portland, Oregon. When agents interviewed Sarah, now in her 70s, she revealed even more disturbing details about her 1989 stay at Whispering Pines. She had found hidden cameras in the cabin's bedrooms, carefully concealed behind mirrors and vents. When she confronted Vance about them, he had dismissed her concerns, claiming they were old security equipment left by previous owners. Sarah's testimony opened a new avenue of investigation. The FBI obtained search warrants for storage units that had been rented by Harold Vance in the 1980s and 1990s. These units, which had been abandoned and eventually auctioned off, contained thousands of hours of videotapes and photographs documenting Vance's surveillance of his victims. The evidence revealed that Vance had been systematically recording families and individuals staying at properties he managed, collecting detailed information about their habits, schedules, and vulnerabilities. The surveillance footage was deeply disturbing. Vance had recorded intimate moments of families' vacations, but more sinister was the evidence of his planning process. The tapes showed him studying his victims' routines, identifying the best times to approach them, and even practicing his methods of abduction. The Lewis family had been under surveillance for the entire first week of their vacation, with Vance documenting their every move and conversation. Among the recovered evidence was a detailed planning document for the Lewis family abduction. Vance had identified Richard as the primary threat due to his size and military background, and had planned to neutralize him first using a combination of deception and drugs. He had studied the family's dynamics, noting that Margaret was protective of her children and would likely comply with demands if their safety was threatened. The document read like a military operation plan, complete with contingency procedures and escape routes. The discovery of Vance's surveillance operation revealed that his crimes were even more systematic than investigators had realized. He had been watching and planning for months before each abduction, ensuring that his victims were completely isolated and that their disappearances would not be immediately noticed. The level of preparation was staggering. He had studied local law enforcement response times, identified the best locations for disposing of evidence, and even researched the family backgrounds of potential victims to ensure they wouldn't be missed immediately. The FBI's analysis of the surveillance materials also revealed connections to other unsolved cases across the western United States. Vance had apparently expanded his operation beyond Northern California, targeting isolated vacation rentals in Oregon, Washington, and Nevada. The surveillance footage showed him scouting properties and potential victims throughout the region, suggesting that his crimes were part of a much larger operation that spanned multiple states. One of the most chilling discoveries was a series of psychological profiles that Vance had created for his victims. He'd studied their personalities, fears, and relationships, developing detailed strategies for breaking their will and maintaining control. The profiles for the Lewis family were particularly disturbing, showing that Vance had identified Emily as the most psychologically vulnerable and had planned to use her distress to control the rest of the family. The new evidence also revealed that Vance had been in contact with other predators, sharing information and techniques through encrypted correspondence and coded messages. The FBI discovered evidence of a network of individuals involved in similar crimes, operating across multiple countries and coordinating their activities to avoid detection. This revelation transformed the case from a single predator story into evidence of an international criminal organization. The psychological impact of these discoveries on the Lewis family's survivors was devastating. Patricia Lewis Morrison, Margaret's sister, had spent over 30 years wondering what had happened to her sister's family. Learning the extent of Vance's planning and surveillance made the crimes feel even more personal and violating. The family had been hunted like animals, studied and planned for like a military operation, and their suffering had been methodically orchestrated by someone who saw them as nothing more than experimental subjects. In 2022, the FBI created a new task force specifically dedicated to tracking Harold Vance and his associated network. The task force, known as Operation Whispering Pines, coordinates with law enforcement agencies across the Americas and has identified over 40 potential victims of Vance's organization. The task force believes that Vance may still be alive and operating, possibly training new recruits in his methods and expanding his criminal network. The most recent development came in early 2023 when a former Guatemala City police detective came forward with information about a possible Vance sighting. The detective, who had retired and moved to the United States, revealed that in 2019 he had investigated a series of disappearances in a remote tourist area of Guatemala. The investigating officer had been threatened and intimidated, and the case had been mysteriously closed by higher authorities. The detective suspected corruption and believed that Vance had paid officials to protect his operation. This revelation led to a diplomatic effort to reopen the Guatemalan investigation, but progress has been slow due to political instability and ongoing concerns about corruption within local law enforcement. The FBI has offered substantial rewards for information leading to Vance's capture, but the challenges of operating in foreign countries with limited resources and questionable law enforcement cooperation continue to hamper the investigation. The Lewis family case has become a teaching tool for law enforcement agencies worldwide, demonstrating how predators can operate undetected for years by exploiting the trust and isolation of the vacation rental industry. The case has led to new protocols for background checks, surveillance systems, and communication procedures designed to protect tourists and prevent similar crimes. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Lewis family story is how it has evolved over the decades. What began as a missing persons case has revealed itself to be part of a sophisticated international criminal operation that may still be active today. Harold Vance was not just a killer, he was the architect of a system designed to identify, capture, and exploit vulnerable people for profit and psychological experimentation. The families of Vance's victims continue to live with the knowledge that their loved ones suffered terribly and that their killer remains free. The Lewis family's story serves as a reminder that evil can hide in the most ordinary places, and that the people we trust with our safety may be the very ones who pose the greatest threat. As long as Harold Vance remains at large, the possibility exists that somewhere in the world another family is being watched, studied, and marked for capture by a predator who has perfected the art of making people disappear. What do you think really happened to the Lewis family? Was this a planned abduction, or did they stumble upon something they shouldn't have seen? Leave your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unsolved mysteries that will keep you awake at night.